Thus far, we've focused almost exclusively on the perspective of the biased person. That is, on the person who has stereotyped, who is being prejudiced, or who discriminates. Now, however, we'll shift the perspective to consider the experience of the person who is experiencing prejudice, and we'll think about ways to cope while experiencing prejudice. So let's start by defining social stigma, which refers to sort of the flip side of prejudice. Social stigma is the experience of being socially discredited or being perceived as flawed by some trait, characteristic, status, attribute, condition, whatever it is. And there are many different attributes that could be stigmatized, including, number one, social statuses, such as being black or being poor. Also physical marks, such as being obese or being blind. And finally, addictions, such as alcohol and drug addictions. And these are by no means all-inclusive, these are just a few examples. Stigma management refers to strategies for coping with stigma at the individual level. As an important distinction here, I'll note that when we discuss interventions in some of our upcoming videos, that's all emphasizing reducing prejudice at a more global level. Stigma management is different from that in that it refers to things you can do on your own to temper the effects of prejudice without actually engaging in sort of a societal level change. You're not necessarily trying to change the prejudiced person, although some of these strategies do have that effect. So again, the difference is stigma management refers to things you can do as an individual. Interventions for reducing prejudice as a whole refers to things we try and do at a societal level to reduce prejudice. And there are two broad categories of stigma management techniques that we'll discuss in this video, and each of them have advantages and disadvantages that I'll highlight in turn. The first broad category of strategies involves strategies for gaining social acceptance, whereas the second category involves strategies for protecting your own psychological well-being without necessarily worrying about what others think about you. Let's start by discussing strategies for gaining social acceptance as a way to manage stigma. The first technique is, for better or worse, to withdraw. Simply, withdrawal means that you simply avoid people who are causing you to feel stigmatized. You avoid these toxic, negative, or biased people. Now, although this sounds like a relatively poor strategy or a problematic strategy, withdrawal from people who make you feel stigmatized can be beneficial to you in that it may allow you to gravitate instead toward people who do share similar experiences and similar identities to you. This can lead to greater acceptance and more normal interactions where you don't really have to worry about being stigmatized. And stigmatized people may realize greater acceptance and social opportunity in the non-stigmatized world through social and political activism. Minority and disadvantaged groups that press for change in society do have influence, and stigmatized people can benefit from the social and political power of their in-group. And perhaps even more important, participation in the social activism of their group can help redefine their stigmatizing attribute into a positive label. Another strategy is called passing, which refers to concealing one's stigmatizing attribute or condition from other people. Passing is more possible for some people than others, depending on what the attribute or condition is, which brings us to the concept of visibility, which I've hinted at in previous videos, but will formalize now. Visibility refers to how visibly obvious versus concealable, or relatively invisible, the attribute, condition, or status is. Being gay, for example, or being a paroled convict are both concealable, right? You can for the most part conceal those, so they're relatively invisible statuses. Whereas physical disabilities or being obese or being a racial minority, for example, are all relatively visible statuses that are very hard to conceal. Now, all of these statuses could easily be the target of prejudice if known, but the former group or category of concealable or invisible attributes or statuses have the ability to avoid negative stigmatization altogether if that's what they want. But having an invisible stigmatized social identity isn't really a free pass for, meaning you're not going to deal with any problems. And in fact, studies have long showed that people with invisible identities still express social difficulties, but they're a little bit different and often take the form of feeling different, feeling other, feeling lonely or isolated. And this has been shown to be true more so than for people with visible stigmatized identities. In one study, for example, the researchers asked undergraduates to estimate what percentage of their peers shared their attitudes or preferences. Undergraduates who had invisible, concealable statuses tended to provide significantly smaller estimates, smaller percentages, than undergraduates who had visible statuses. So the concealable group sort of felt more lonely, isolated, like they were on their own. Choosing to conceal or pass can be helpful in avoiding prejudice, but again, it often results in isolation from the camaraderie and protection of other people who share that same stigmatizing attribute. We find greater levels of fear and anxiety associated with the possibility of being found out as well, which leads to avoidance of social situations, which leads further to feelings of loneliness and otherness. In one study, for example, a group of students who said they had an aspect of their identity that they kept hidden tended to have significantly higher levels of psychological distress, and likely as a result of that distress, because we know there's a physical connection to psychological problems, they were more likely to become physically ill compared to their peers who had nothing to conceal. Clearly then, taking advantage of stigma invisibility can have both beneficial but also detrimental effects. Another strategy for gaining social acceptance, is to capitalize on your stigma rather than hiding it or hiding it from others. One technique, for example, is called self-promotion, in which you show other people that you are multidimensional and competent in several different areas. And there are at least two advantages to self-promotion. Number one, it proactively changes the way people see you. We refer to this as your virtual identity, the identities other people see in you versus your actual identity, which is your actual identity that you see in yourself. So it changes your virtual identity to hopefully be more in line with your actual identity. And a second advantage is that it allows others to see and evaluate one's competencies in spite of what others at least assume are the hindrances and disadvantages of being stigmatized. A second technique, which might sound similar but it's a little bit different, is called compensation, in which you deliberately present to other people behavior that contradicts the assumptions held about your abilities or character. For example, a person in a wheelchair who excels in sports. In regards to compensation, as with self-promotion, compensating for a presumed failing or fault strives to reshape that virtual identity. It reshapes the way other people see you, and it reduces stigma in that way. And research suggests that not only is compensation often used by other people, by stigmatized people, but it also improves their social image. So it is effective. So those are some strategies for gaining social acceptance, but let's discuss strategies for protecting your psychological well-being. These strategies are cognitive in nature. They involve the way you think, and they involve thinking about your stigma and the experiences associated with that stigma in ways that are beneficial to your self-esteem and just your overall well-being. One such strategy is to simply attribute negative outcomes to prejudice. Let me describe what I mean by that. There are at least two reasons you may have experienced a negative outcome. For example, this could be anything: not being offered a job for which you are qualified, receiving a negative evaluation on work you thought was of good quality, or whatever. One possibility is that the negative outcome was the result of some inadequacy, fault, or failure on your part. Maybe you weren't actually qualified for that job, or maybe you did poor work and so you got that negative evaluation and it was deserved. But it's also possible that the negative outcome was due to another person's prejudice against you, the stigmatized person. Research shows that assuming the latter is connected to better psychological outcomes than assuming the former. Because it's often difficult to determine exactly why something occurred, why this negative outcome happened, attributing negative outcomes to prejudice is a plausible and adaptive strategy for stigmatized people. In a test of this strategy, Jennifer Crocker and her colleagues had Black college students receive a negative evaluation from a bogus white evaluator who could either see them or a white evaluator who could not see them. And the researchers reasoned that it would be impossible for participants to attribute negative feedback to prejudice when the evaluator couldn't see them and therefore couldn't identify that they were Black. The results of this study showed that receiving a negative evaluation from a white evaluator did lower Black participants' self-esteem, but only when they could not be seen. In other words, participants who were afforded the opportunity to blame the negative evaluation on prejudice did so and did not have lowered self-esteem as a result. Similar results, by the way, were obtained when women received negative feedback from a male evaluator in a follow-up study. Another strategy, which I don't like quite as much, is to simply devalue negative outcome dimensions. The principle here is really simple. Receiving criticism about some quality or status that you don't care much about, right, a dimension that you don't value much, shouldn't affect you as much. Now, although this is beneficial psychologically, it does protect your well-being, psychological well-being, but it also has the cost of simplifying your self-concept, simplifying your identity. It encourages you to abandon aspects of your identity that you might otherwise care about. So again, it is effective, but there are advantages and disadvantages here. A somewhat similar, but in my opinion more positive strategy is self-affirmation, which refers to the process of rebuilding your self-worth when threatened by focusing on some other important positive aspect of your self-concept, of your identity that has not been threatened. For example, a person who is often stigmatized for being obese may self-affirm by sort of emphasizing, thinking about, focusing on other aspects of their identity that they are confident about, like their intelligence, their skills in sports, their identity as a gamer, how much they love to snowboard, or how good of a drummer they are. And finally, we have mindfulness, which is a technique that sort of shifts the focus from engaging and responding to rather than disengaging and trying to escape from people's thoughts and reactions to stigma. Mindfulness is the centerpiece of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT or ACT, which is an approach to psychotherapy that has been applied with success to reduce perceived discrimination and self-stigma, which is what we call internalizing others' negative assumptions about oneself, among people with stigmatizing qualities such as racial minority status and alcoholism. And this has been shown for all sorts of other dimensions as well. As you can hopefully see, there are all sorts of things you can do to cope with stigma. Some of these strategies involve trying to please others. Others involve trying to sort of please yourself, accept yourself, and see yourself in more positive terms. All of these techniques have been shown in the psychological literature to be effective at coping with stigma, but as I've emphasized over and over again, all of them also have clear advantages and disadvantages.